In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a whisper slithers through the rousses. A stranger. Victor Crane arrives, his charm masking a shadow that haunts the churchyard at midnight. Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet knitting, unravels a web of secrets. A woman in a red coat, a grave marked Lillian Marsh, and a letter that chills the soul. As whispers turn to clues, a dropped note, a hidden locket, a buried box, the truth creeps closer, revealing a past of betrayal and a faked death. But when the grave speaks, will it expose a crime, or conceal a darker fate waiting in the shadows? Chapter 1. The Whisper in St. Mary Mead. In the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned with the gentle predictability of a well-wound clock, life unfolded in a rhythm as familiar as the church bells on Sunday. The cottages, with their thatched roofs and ivy-clad walls, stood like sentinels of a simpler time, guarding secrets that rarely saw daylight. The villagers, bound by habit and proximity, knew each other's routines as intimately as their own. Yet, beneath the surface of this idyllic hamlet, where roses bloomed with defiant cheer and tea was poured with ceremonial precision, there stirred a current of curiosity, a whisper that promised to disturb the peace. Miss Jane Marple, an elderly spinster with a crown of soft white hair and eyes as sharp as the needles she wielded, sat by her drawing-room window, her fingers deftly working a pale pink shawl. The light of late afternoon filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. Her cottage, modest yet meticulously kept, was a haven of order, its shelves lined with books and its garden a testament to her quiet diligence. From her vantage point, she could see the high street, where villagers moved with the unhurried pace of those who had nowhere pressing to go. The post office, the bakery, the vicarage all were within her view, and with them the pulse of St. Mary Mead. It was on this particular afternoon, as the September sun dipped low and the air carried the first crisp hint of autumn, that Miss Marple's attention was caught by a snippet of conversation drifting from the street. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, a woman whose efficiency was matched only by her appetite for news, stood outside her shop, speaking in hushed tones to Mrs. Hayworth, the baker's wife. Their voices, though low, carried on the still air, and Miss Marple, with her knack for hearing what others missed, caught the name Victor Crane. Arrived just yesterday, he did, Mrs. Price was saying, her spectacles glinting as she leaned closer, renting Hawthorn Cottage, of all places. A fine-looking man, mind you, but there's something about him. Too polished, if you ask me. Mrs. Hayworth, whose round face was perpetually flushed from the heat of her ovens, nodded vigorously. Handsome, I'll grant, but why come to St. Mary Mead? A man like that belongs in London, not here among us plain folk. And have you heard? Elsie Barrow saw him last night, near the churchyard, pacing like a man with a secret. Miss Marple. Needles paused, just for a moment, before resuming their steady click. The churchyard, an odd place for a newcomer to linger, especially at night. Hawthorn Cottage, too, was a curious choice tucked at the edge of the village, its garden overgrown and its windows perpetually shuttered until now. She made a mental note of Victor Crane, filing his name alongside the countless others she had observed over the years. People, she had learned, were like her knitting patterns, simple on the surface, but prone to tangles if you didn't watch closely. The village, for all its drowsy charm, was a fertile ground for gossip. It grew like the bindweed in Miss Marple's garden, tenacious and impossible to uproot. She did not disapprove of gossip, not entirely. It was, after all, a kind of social tapestry, woven from half-truths and keen observation, and she had long ago learned to discern the threads of fact from the embellishments. Mrs. Price and Mrs. Hayworth were reliable weavers, their tongues quick but their eyes sharp. If Victor Crane was pacing the churchyard, there was a reason, and Miss Marple intended to find it. She rose from her chair, setting her knitting aside, and adjusted her spectacles. A walk to the post office would do. Nicely, she needed stamps, or so she would say, but her true purpose was to gauge the village's mood. Gossip, like a breeze, could shift direction, and she wanted to catch its current before it grew into a storm. The high street was a study in familiarity. Mr. Tuttle, the grocer, swept his doorstep with arthritic deliberation. Young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's apprentice, darted past with a parcel of sausages, and Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, waved cheerfully as she carried a basket of apples from the vicarage orchard. Miss Marple returned the wave, her smile as gentle as ever, but her mind was elsewhere. She noted the glances exchanged between passers-by, the slight pauses in conversation as she approached. The village was abuzz, and Victor Crane was its cause. At the post office, Mrs. Price greeted her with the warmth reserved for a valued customer, though her eyes betrayed a hunger for further talk. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said, adjusting a stack of envelopes with unnecessary care. "Fine day, isn't it? Though I dare say it's been livelier than usual." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of polite curiosity. "Oh, has something happened, Mrs. Price?" The postmistress needed no further prompting. "It's that Mr. Crane, the new tenant at Hawthorn Cottage. Quite the stir he's caused. Elsie Barrow, you know her, the butcher's girl, says she saw him last night near the churchyard, looking as if he were waiting for someone. And Mrs. Hayworth says he's got the manners of a gentleman, but there's a look in his eye like he's hiding something." Miss Marple tilted her head, as if considering this for the first time. "The churchyard, you say? An odd place for an evening stroll. Perhaps he was admiring the architecture. The yew tree is quite fine this time of year." Double quotes. Mrs. Price snorted softly. "Admiring my foot. Elsie says he was pacing back and forth like a man with a guilty conscience, and he's been asking questions about the village, to about who lives where, who's been here longest. It's not natural, if you ask me." Miss Marple purchased her stamps, murmuring her thanks, and stepped back into the street. The churchyard again. She thought of its ancient stones, weathered by time, and the names they bore, names like Mary Dacre, who were drowned in the mill stream 50 years ago, or old Jeremiah Finch, whose miserly ways had left a legacy of whispered tales. The churchyard was a place of memory, but also of secrets, and Miss Marple wondered what had drawn Victor Crane to its shadows. She decided to visit the vicarage next. Mrs. Clement, a kind but slightly flustered woman, was always a font of information, often without realizing it. As Miss Marple walked, her sensible shoes clicking on the cobblestones, she passed Hawthorn Cottage. Its windows were open now, the curtains pushed aside, and she caught a glimpse of a man's silhouette inside, tall, dark-haired, moving with the restless energy of someone unaccustomed to stillness. Victor Crane, no doubt. She did not linger, but her mind catalogued the image, adding it to the growing pattern of her thoughts at the vicarage. Mrs. Clement was in the garden, wrestling with a particularly stubborn weed. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, brushing dirt from her hands. "What a pleasant surprise. Do come in for tea. I've just had a batch of scones from Mrs. Hayworth, and they're quite splendid. Over tea and scones, served on the vicarage's best china, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the newcomer. "I hear we have a new resident at Hawthorn Cottage," she said, spreading clotted cream with care. "A Mr. Crane, I believe." Mrs. Clement's eyes widened, delighted to share. "Oh yes, he came to the vicarage yesterday, you know, to introduce himself. Very charming, very polite. He's from London, I gather, though he was vague about his business. Something to do with investments, I think. He's promised to donate to the Church Restoration Fund, which is awfully generous for someone just arrived." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of mild interest. "How kind of him. Did he mention why he chose St. Mary Mead?" "Not a word," Mrs. Clement said, leaning forward. "But he did ask about the churchyard, wanted to know if it was still in use, which I thought rather odd. I told him we haven't had a burial there in years, not since poor Mrs. Langley passed. He seemed very interested, though he didn't say why." The churchyard again. Miss Marple's mind turned to the old graves, their inscriptions worn but legible, each one a story of its own. She thought of the yew tree, its branches heavy with age, and the bench beneath it where villagers sometimes sat to reflect. What had Victor Crane been doing there? Waiting, as Elsie Barrow claimed, or searching for something? As she left the vicarage, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the village. Miss Marple took the longer route home, passing the churchyard itself. The iron gate creaked as she pushed it open, and she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape. The graves were orderly, their stones tilted slightly by time, and the yew tree stood sentinel at the far end. She walked slowly, her footsteps soft on the grass, and paused by the grave of Lillian Marsh, a name that had surfaced in her memory earlier that day. Lillian had been a local girl, married young and died in London, or so the records said. Her grave was unremarkable, its stone plain. But Miss Marple noted a faint disturbance in the earth nearby, a patch where the grass seemed newly pressed. She bent to examine it, her knees protesting slightly, and saw the faint outline of a footprint. Not deep, but deliberate, as if someone had stood here recently, perhaps last night. She straightened, her mind racing. Victor Crane, pacing the churchyard, and now a footprint near Lillian Marsh's grave. It was too early to draw conclusions, but Miss Marple knew better than to ignore such signs. People, she had observed, often revealed themselves in the smallest details. A glance, a word, a footprint in the earth. Back at her cottage, she settled into her chair, picking up her knitting once more. The village was quiet now, the high street empty, but she could feel the undercurrent of unease. Victor Crane was a stranger, and strangers brought change. She thought of the gossip she had heard, each piece a fragment of a larger puzzle. Mrs. Price's suspicion, Elsie Barrow's sighting, Mrs. Clement's account of his questions. They were like stitches, waiting to be woven into a pattern. Miss Marple. Needles moved with quiet precision, the pink shawl growing beneath her fingers. She thought of her niece, Mabel, who had once laughed at her aunt's habit of seeing mysteries in everyday life. "You see villains in every shadow, Aunt Jane," Mabel had teased. But Miss Marple knew that shadows often hid truths, and in St. Mary Mead, where life seemed so predictable, the shadows were deepest of all. She decided to attend the village fete tomorrow, where Victor Crane was sure to make an appearance. It would be a chance to observe him, to see how he moved among the villagers, whether his charm held or faltered under scrutiny. She would also speak to Elsie Barrow, whose nervous eyes suggested she knew more than she had let on. Young girls? Miss Marple had found were often the key to unlocking secrets, their observations unfiltered by the caution of age. As night fell, Miss Marple lit a single lamp and opened her notebook, a small leather-bound volume where she jotted her thoughts. She wrote, Victor Crane, Hawthorn Cottage, churchyard, Lillian Marsh, footprint. The words were sparse, but they held weight. She closed the notebook and gazed out at the darkened village, where the lights of Hawthorn Cottage still burned. Gossip, she knew, was a dangerous thing. It could be harmless, a fleeting amusement, or it could grow sharp, cutting through lives like a blade. In St. Mary Mead, where every whisper was heard, Miss Marple suspected that Victor Crane's arrival was no mere coincidence. Something had drawn him here, something tied to the churchyard and perhaps to Lillian Marsh. She would watch and she would listen, for in the quiet of the village, the truth was never far from the surface. The clock on the mantel chimed 9, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Tomorrow, she would begin to unravel the mystery of Victor Crane. For now, she blew out the lamp and retired to bed, her mind as alert as ever, weaving patterns in the dark. Chapter 2. The man in question, the morning sun, bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, softening the edges of the cobblestone paths and glinting off the dukest roses that climbed the walls of its cottages. The village fete, an annual affair, held on the vicarage lawn, was in full preparation, with trestle tables being set up and bunting strung between the ancient oaks. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her best tweed skirt and a lavender blouse, her straw hat tilted just so, made her way to the fete with a basket of homemade lavender sachets for the charity stall. Her step was light, but her eyes were keen, scanning the gathering crowd for the man who had set tongues wagging, Victor Crane. The fete was a microcosm of village life, where every glance and murmured word carried weight. Children darted between stalls, clutching toffee apples, while their elders exchanged pleasantries laced with subtle inquiries. Miss Marple, known to all as a gentle soul with a knack for noticing what others overlooked, was greeted warmly. She smiled and nodded, her mind attuned to the undercurrents beneath the cheerful bustle. Victor Crane, she had learned, was to judge the flower competition, a role that ensured he would be at the heart of the day's events. She spotted him near the tea tent, a tall figure in a well-cut grey suit, his dark hair flecked with silver, catching the light. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that invited trust-sharp jaw, warm brown eyes, and a smile that seemed to promise confidences shared. Yet there was a restlessness in his movements, a slight tension in his shoulders, as if he were playing a part and feared missing a cue. He stood beside Mrs. Clement, who was explaining the finer points of dahlia cultivation, and his laughter rang out, charming but just a shade too loud. Miss Marple approached the flower stall, where Mrs. Hayworth was arranging her prize roses. "A fine day for the fete," Miss Marple remarked, her voice soft as she admired a crimson bloom. "And I see our new resident is making himself at home." Mrs. Hayworth's eyes gleamed with the delight of shared knowledge. "Oh, Mr. Crane's the talk of the village, isn't he? So polite, so generous with his time. He's promised a guinea to the winner of the flower show, you know." But she lowered her voice, glancing toward the tea tent. "There's something about him. Clara, my niece, says she saw him at the post office, asking about old families in the village. Why would a man like that care about our dusty history?" Miss Marple's fingers brushed the petals of a rose, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Perhaps he's a historian at heart," she suggested, though her mind was elsewhere. Old families, the phrase lingered, tugging at a memory she couldn't quite place. She thanked Mrs. Hayworth and moved toward the tea tent, where Victor was now surrounded by a small crowd of villagers, each vying for his attention. He was, she noted, a master of deflection. When Mr. Tuttle, the grocer, asked about his profession, Victor spoke vaguely of consulting and city matters, then swiftly complimented Mrs. Tuttle's embroidered tablecloth. When young Tommy Pierce inquired about London, Victor regaled him with a tale of a West End theatre, sidestepping any mention of his own life there. Miss Marple, sipping a cup of Earl Grey, observed how his eyes darted briefly to the churchyard, visible beyond the vicarage hedge, before returning to his audience with a practiced smile. She decided to test him, approaching with her basket. She said, "Mr. Crane, how kind of you to join our little fete. St. Mary Mead must seem terribly quiet after London." His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of wariness, quickly masked. "Not at all, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice smooth as polished oak. "There's a charm here one doesn't find in the city. The history, the stories, is quite captivating." "History, indeed," she said, her tone light. "The churchyard, for instance, holds many tales. Have you visited it yet? The old graves are quite poignant." His smile tightened, just enough for her to notice. "I've passed by," he said. "A peaceful spot. I must explore it properly sometime." He excused himself, claiming a need to judge the dahlias, and Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing the exchange. He was guarded, but not careless. A man with something to hide, perhaps, but what? The fete continued, with laughter and the clink of teacups filling the air. Miss Marple made her way to the cake stall, where Elsie Barrow, the butcher's daughter, was helping her mother. Elsie was a slight girl of 19, with nervous hands and eyes that darted like a startled deer's. Miss Marple had heard from Mrs. Price that Elsie had seen Victor Crane in the churchyard, and she intended to learn more. "Elsie, my dear," Miss Marple said, selecting a slice of Victoria sponge, "you're looking quite busy today. I hear you've had quite an adventure, spotting our new resident in the churchyard." Elsie's cheeks flushed, and she fumbled with a napkin. "Oh, it was nothing, Miss Marple. I just saw him, that's all. Near the yew tree, late it was. I was coming back from Clara's, and he was there, walking back and forth, alone." Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but probing. Elsie hesitated, her fingers twisting the napkin. "I thought so, at first. But there was someone else, I think. A shadow, near the gate. I couldn't see clear, it was dark, and I didn't want to linger." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly concern. "Of course, my dear. It's easy to imagine things in the dark, but you've a good eye. Did you notice anything else about Mr. Crane?" Elsie bit her lip. He seemed agitated, kept looking at his watch, like he was waiting for someone. And he had a parcel, small, wrapped in brown paper. I didn't think much of it then, but it stuck in my mind. A parcel. Miss Marple filed the detail away, thanking Elsie and moving on. The girl's nervousness suggested she had seen more than she was ready to admit, but pressing her now would yield nothing. Young people, Miss Marple knew, needed time to trust, like plants needing gentle tending before they bloomed. As the fete wound down, Miss Marple lingered near the vicarage gate, watching Victor Crane bid farewell to the villagers. His charm was undeniable, but there was a calculated quality to it, as if he were measuring each interaction. She thought of Elsie's words, "Shadow near the gate, a parcel in hand." And then there was Mrs. Hayworth's mention of old families. The pieces were disparate, but Miss Marple sensed they belonged to the same pattern, one she could not yet see clearly. She returned home as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village. In her drawing room, she picked up her knitting, the pale pink shawl taking shape beneath her fingers. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, weaving through the day's observations. Victor Crane was no ordinary visitor. His interest in the churchyard, his questions about old families, his guarded responses, they all pointed to a purpose. One he was careful to conceal. Miss Marple thought of her friend, Dolly Bantry, who had once remarked that St. Mary Mead was like a stage, with everyone playing a part. Victor Crane, she suspected, was playing a role, but whether he was hero, villain, or something in between, she could not yet say. She would watch him, as she watched everyone, with the patience of one who knew that secrets, like dropped stitches, always revealed themselves in time as she knitted. A memory surfaced, an old story from her youth, about a man who had come to a village, much like St. Mary Mead, charming and mysterious, only to leave behind a trail of heartbreak. The details were hazy, but the lesson was clear. Strangers brought change, and change was rarely benign. She resolved to visit the churchyard herself tomorrow, to see what had drawn Victor Crane to its shadows. The clock chimed 7, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside. She opened her notebook, adding a new entry: Victor Crane, churchyard, parcel, shadow at the gate, old families. The words were few, but they carried weight. She closed the notebook and gazed out at the darkening village, where the lights of Hawthorn Cottage glowed faintly. Somewhere in those lights, she knew, lay the truth, waiting to be unraveled. Chapter 3. The woman in red. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a veil, softening the outlines of its cottages and muffling the clatter of milk bottles on doorsteps. Miss Jane Marple, awake with the dawn, sat at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a slice of toast, her thoughts as crisp as the autumn air. The village fete had left a residue of excitement, but it was the figure of Victor Crane, the whispers surrounding him, that occupied her mind. Elsie Barrow's tale of a shadow in the churchyard, coupled with Mrs. Hayworth's remark about old families, had stirred her curiosity. Yet it was the new thread of gossip, overheard as she left the fete, that now held her attention. A woman in a red coat, seen with Victor Crane near the old mill. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the window where the first rays of sun pierced the mist. The old mill, a crumbling relic at the edge of the village, was a place of quiet neglect, its wheel long stilled. It was not a spot for casual encounters, and the mention of a woman in red intrigued her. In St. Mary Mead, where fashion leaned toward sensible tweeds and muted greens, a red coat was as conspicuous as a peacock in a henhouse. She resolved to learn more, but first she would visit the churchyard, where Victor's nocturnal pacing had left its mark. Dressed in a woolen cardigan and her sturdy walking shoes, Miss Marple set out, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The village was stirring now, with Mr. Tuttle sweeping his shop front and Mrs. Price sorting the Morning Post. She nodded to them, her smile as unassuming as ever, but her eyes missed nothing. At the churchyard gate, she paused, noting the grass and the faint path worn by recent footsteps. The yew tree loomed ahead, its branches casting dappled shadows over the graves. She moved toward Lillian Marsh's stone, recalling the footprint she had seen 2 days prior. The earth was undisturbed now, the grass springing back, but the memory of that mark lingered as she stood by the grave, Her thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of gravel. Turning, she saw Clara, Mrs. Hayworth's niece, approaching with a hesitant step. Clara was a typist at the solicitor's office, a quiet girl with sharp features and a tendency to blush under scrutiny. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, clutching a small bouquet of chrysanthemums. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Nor I you, Clara," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but probing. "Bringing flowers for someone special." Clara's blush deepened. "For my gran. Over by the wall. I come sometimes to tidy her grave." She hesitated, then added, "I heard about Mr. Crane being here, in the churchyard. Elsie told me. It's queer, isn't it?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes gentle but alert. "Queer, indeed. Elsie mentioned a shadow, and now there's talk of a woman in a red coat. Have you heard anything, Clara?" The girl's hands tightened around the bouquet. "Only what's going round. Mrs. Langley, she's the station master's wife, says she saw a woman in a red coat near the station, carrying a suitcase. Looked like she was waiting for the London train, but it never came. And old Mr. Finch from the farm swears he saw her by the mill, talking to Mr. Crane. Said they looked cross with each other." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the threads. Together, a woman in a red coat, seen at the station and the mill, both places of transit and secrecy. And Victor Crane, at the heart of it all. Did Mr. Finch say anything else? She asked. Clara shook her head. Only that the woman had fair hair, and her coat was bright, like blood. He thought it odd, her being there at dusk. She glanced at the churchyard gate, as if eager to leave. "I should go, Miss Marple. Gran's grave needs tending." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, watching Clara hurry away. The girl's unease was palpable, and Miss Marple wondered if she knew more than she had shared. Young people, she reflected, often saw more than they admitted, their silence born of fear or loyalty. She left the churchyard and took the path toward the old mill, a mile from the village centre. The mill stood by a sluggish stream, its stone walls moss-covered, and its windows boarded. As she approached, she noticed fresh footprints in the mud, two sets, one larger, one smaller, leading to the mill's rusted door. She paused, her heart quickening. The smaller prints were those of a woman's shoe, narrow and pointed, unlike the sturdy boots favoured by village women. She followed them to the door, which hung slightly ajar, and peered inside. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew, and the floor was littered with leaves. Nothing seemed amiss, yet the prints suggested a recent visit. Miss Marple returned to the village, her mind turning over the new details. At the post office, she found Mrs. Price in her element, sorting letters while dispensing news. "Miss Marple, have you heard?" The postmistress said, barely waiting for a reply. "That woman in the red coat, Mrs. Langley's certain she was at the station, looking furtive. And now, Tommy Pierce says he saw her near the mill, arguing with Mr. Crane. What do you make of it?" "I'm sure it's nothing serious," Miss Marple said, her tone deliberately vague. "People do meet in odd places. Perhaps she's a friend of Mr. Crane's, visiting from London." Mrs. Price snorted. "A friend, you say? Looked more like trouble, if you ask me." Tommy said she was waving her arms, and Mr. Crane was shouting something about money. Doesn't sound friendly to me. Money. Miss Marple filed the word away, thanking Mrs. Price and purchasing a postcard. As she stepped outside, she saw Victor Crane himself, crossing the high street toward Hawthorn Cottage. He carried a small leather case, and his stride was brisk, almost urgent. She watched him disappear inside, noting the quick glance he cast over his shoulder, as if ensuring he was not followed. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Clement at the vicarage, bringing a jar of her homemade gooseberry jam as a pretext. Over tea, she steered the conversation to Victor Crane. "He seems quite taken with St. Mary Mead," she said, spreading jam on a scone. "Though I hear he's had a visitor, a woman in a red coat." Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. "Oh yes, I heard about her. Mrs. Langley mentioned it at the Women's Institute. Said she looked out of place, like she didn't belong here. And then there's Mr. Finch's story arguing with Mr. Crane by the mill. It's all very mysterious, isn't it?" Miss Marple agreed, her expression one of mild concern. "I suppose she could be a relative, or perhaps a business acquaintance. Mr. Crane mentioned investments, didn't he?" Mrs. Clement nodded. "He did, though he was awfully vague. But he's been so generous, promised another donation to the church fund yesterday. Said it was in memory of someone dear. I thought it rather touching." Miss Marple's fingers paused on her teacup. "In memory of someone dear," she repeated softly. "Did he say who?" "No, he didn't. Just smiled and changed the subject. You know how he is charming, but you never quite get a straight answer." Miss Marple left the vicarage with her thoughts in a whirl. A woman in a red coat, arguments, money, a donation in memory of someone dear. The pieces were accumulating, but the pattern remained elusive. She decided to take her evening walk past Hawthorn Cottage, hoping for a glimpse of something or someone that might clarify the puzzle. As dusk settled, casting a violet hue over the village, Miss Marple approached the cottage. Its windows were lit, but the curtains were drawn, allowing only slivers of light to escape. She lingered by the hedge, her presence as unremarkable as the twilight itself. Then, faintly, she heard voices, a man's, low and urgent, and a woman's, sharp with anger. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. A confrontation, not a conversation. She edged closer, careful to stay hidden, and caught a single phrase, "You can't keep running." The woman's voice. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She waited, hoping to hear more, but the voices ceased, and a moment later, the front door opened. Victor Crane stepped out, his face pale, his leather case in hand. He glanced up and down the street, then set off toward the station. Miss Marple slipped back into the shadows, her mind racing. The woman in the red coat, she suspected, was no casual visitor. She was tied to Victor's past, and her presence in St. Mary Mead was no accident. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit her lamp and opened her notebook. She wrote, "Woman in red. Coat, mill, station, argument, money, donation in memory." She paused, then added, "You can't keep running." The words felt heavy, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through her thoughts. She thought of Lillian Marsh's grave, the footprint, Victor's pacing. The woman in the red coat was a key, but to what lock? As she knitted. That evening, her needles moving with their usual rhythm, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of secrets. In St. Mary Mead, they were like seeds, buried deep but always ready to sprout. Victor Crane, with his charm and his shadows, had brought such a seed to the village. The woman in the red coat, whoever she was part of it. Miss Marple would watch, and she would listen, for the truth, she knew, was never far from the surface, waiting only for the right moment to break free. Chapter 4. A Disappearance. The rhythm of St. Mary Mead, so steady in its daily cadence, faltered in the days following the village fete. The air, now sharp with the bite of early autumn, carried a new tension, as if the village itself sensed a shift. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her drawing-room window with her knitting, felt it keenly. The gossip that had swirled around Victor Crane and the woman in the red coat had taken a curious turn. The woman, so vivid in the village's chatter, had vanished. No new sightings, no whispered tales of her scarlet coat by the mill or the station. It was as if she had dissolved into the mist that clung to the meadows each morning. Miss Marple's needles moved with their usual precision, the pale pink shawl growing beneath her fingers, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of Elsie Barrow's nervous account of the churchyard shadow, Clara's mention of an argument by the mill, and the sharp words she had overheard outside Hawthorn Cottage. "You can't keep running." The woman in the red coat was no phantom, but her sudden absence was troubling. In a village where every stranger was noted, such a disappearance was not merely odd, it was significant. She decided to begin her day with a visit to the butcher's shop, where Elsie Barrow worked alongside her father. The shop, with its gleaming counter and the faint tang of meat in the air, was a hub of village talk, second only to the post office. As Miss Marple entered, the bell above the door jingled, and Elsie looked up from wrapping a parcel of chops. Her eyes, usually bright, were shadowed with unease. "Good morning, Elsie," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but measured. "I thought I'd pick up a bit of lamb for supper, and perhaps a word with you, if you've a moment." Elsie's hands fumbled with the string, and she glanced at her father, who was busy in the back. "Of course, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "What's on your mind?" Miss Marple selected a small cut of lamb, taking her time. "I've been thinking about that woman in the red coat," she said, as if it were a passing thought. "The one you saw by the mill with Mr. Crane. No one's mentioned her lately. Have you seen her since?" Elsie's cheeks paled, and she shook her head. "Not a glimpse, Miss Marple. It's queer, isn't it? She was the talk of the village, and now nothing. I asked Clara, but she hasn't seen her either. It's like she's gone, just like that." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. "People do come and go, of course. But you said you heard them arguing, didn't you? Did you catch anything specific? Her name, perhaps?" Elsie hesitated, her fingers twisting the string into a knot. I think I heard him call her Lillian. It was quick, and I wasn't sure, but it stuck with me. I didn't tell anyone else, Miss Marple, not even Clara. It felt private, somehow." "Lillian," Miss Marple repeated softly, as if testing the name. "How interesting. And you're sure you haven't seen her since?" "Not a sign," Elsie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been past the mill, even looked at the station, but there's nothing. It's like she was never here." Miss Marple thanked her, paid for the lamb, and stepped back into the high street. Lillian, the name echoed in her mind, tugging at the memory of the churchyard grave. Lillian Marsh, dead these 20 years. A coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple had little faith in coincidences. They were like dropped stitches, small errors that could unravel the whole pattern if you pulled at them. Her next stop was the post office, where Mrs. Price was sorting letters with her usual efficiency. The postmistress's eyes lit up at the sight of Miss Marple, sensing a chance to share the latest news. "Miss Marple, you're out early," she said, pushing her spectacles up her nose. "Have you heard? That woman in the red coat's gone. Quiet. Not a word about her since Sunday. Mrs. Langley's certain she caught the London train, but there's no record of it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild surprise. No record. How curious. And Mr. Crane has. He been about? Oh, he's been seen. All right, Mrs. Price said, leaning forward. Bought a newspaper yesterday. Cool as you please, but he looked peaky, if you ask me. And he asked about the train schedules. London, Bristol, even Exeter, like he's planning to bolt. Miss Marple purchased a few envelopes, her mind turning over the new information. Victor Crane, agitated and inquiring about trains. The woman in the red coat vanished without a trace, and the name Lillian, linking the present to a grave in the churchyard. She thanked Mrs. Price and made her way to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was pruning her roses with a vigour that suggested she was wrestling with more than thorns. "Miss Marple, how lovely!" Mrs. Clement exclaimed, brushing dirt from her gloves. "Do come in. I'm in need of a break, and I've some fresh lemonade." Over lemonade in the vicarage's sunny parlour, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the village's latest mystery. "I hear the woman in the red coat has quite disappeared," she said, stirring her glass. "It's rather odd, don't you think?" Mrs. Clement's eyes widened, delighted to delve into the topic. "Isn't it just? I was saying to the vicar, it's like she was a ghost. One day she's everywhere Mill Station, arguing with Mr. Crane, and the next, poof, gone. I did hear something, though, from Mrs. Finch. She says her husband saw the woman drop something by the Miller handkerchief, embroidered with an L. He didn't pick it up, thought it wasn't proper, but it stayed with him." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her glass. "A handkerchief with an L," she said, her voice soft. "How intriguing. And Mr. Crane, has he seen himself?" Mrs. Clement frowned. "Now you mention it, he was at the church yesterday, looking at the old records. Said he was interested in local history, but he was awfully specific, asked about burials from 20 years ago. The vicar thought it peculiar, but you know how he is. Always happy to talk history." Miss Marple's mind raced. Victor Crane, poring over burial records, and a woman named Lillian, now vanished. She finished her lemonade, thanked Mrs. Clement, and took her leave, her thoughts spinning like a spindle. The churchyard beckoned once more, its secrets pulling at her like a tide. That evening, as the village settled into the quiet of twilight, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill. The gate creaked as she entered, and she moved with purpose toward Lillian Marsh's grave. The stone was, as she remembered, plain and weathered, its inscription barely legible in the fading light. Lillian Marsh, 1895 to 1905, taken too soon. She studied the ground, searching for signs of disturbance. But the grass was smooth, as if no one had been there since her last visit. Yet something felt different. Stillness, heavy and expectant, as if the grave itself were holding its breath. She lingered, her eyes scanning the churchyard. The yew tree cast its long shadow, and beyond it, the path to the mill wound through the dusk. Miss Marple thought of the handkerchief, the argument, the name Lillian. She recalled a story from her youth, of a woman who had vanished from a village, leaving only rumours and a single clue, a locket found by a stream. The parallel was not exact, but it stirred her instincts. People did not vanish without reason, and in St. Mary Mead, reasons were rarely simple. As she turned to leave, a rustle caught her ear. She froze, her heart quickening, and peered into the shadows. A figure moved near the churchyard wall, too fleeting to identify, but the glimpse of a dark coat sent a shiver through her. She waited, but the figure did not reappear, and the silence returned, heavy as before. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit her lamp and opened her notebook. She wrote, "Woman in red coat, gone, Lillian. Handkerchief with L. Victor Crane, burial records, train schedules." She paused, then added, "Figure in. Churchyard, dark coat." The entries were sparse, but they formed a thread, delicate yet strong. She thought of Victor Crane, his charm now tinged with desperation, and the woman in the red coat, whose absence was louder than her presence had been. As she knitted, her system, her needles clicking softly, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of disappearances. In a village like St. Mary Mead, where every face was known, the absence of a stranger was as conspicuous as a shout in a quiet room. The woman in the red coat, whether named Lillian or not, had left a void that whispered of secrets, and Miss Marple knew that secrets, like shadows, grew longer in the dark. She would unravel this one, stitch by stitch, for the truth was never as far buried as it seemed. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Churchyard. The twilight hung over St. Mary Mead like a gossamer curtain, softening the edges of the village and lending an air of secrecy to its quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the evening, chill, stood at her garden gate, her eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the church spire. The disappearance of the woman in the red coat had left the village unsettled, its gossip now tinged with unease rather than excitement. Miss Marple, with her knack for sensing the undercurrents of human behavior, felt the shift acutely. The name Lillian, dropped by Elsie Barrow, and the fleeting figure she had glimpsed in the churchyard last night gnawed at her thoughts, like a pattern in her knitting that refused to align. She had resolved to return to the churchyard at dusk, under the pretext of tending the vicarage flower beds, which bordered the sacred ground. The flower beds were a convenient excuse, one that allowed her to linger without arousing suspicion. As she walked, her sensible shoes silent on the damp grass, she carried a small trowel and a basket of bulbs, her props as carefully chosen as a stage actress's. The churchyard, with its ancient use and weathered stones, held secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover what had drawn Victor Crane and perhaps another to its shadows. The air was cool, the sky streaked with hues of violet and gold, and the village was settling into its evening hush. The churchyard gate creaked as she pushed it open, and she stepped inside, her eyes sweeping the familiar landscape. The graves lay in orderly rows, their inscriptions softened by time, and the yew tree stood at the far end, its branches heavy with age. She moved toward the vicarage flower beds, kneeling to plant a few bulbs, her hands busy but her senses alert. The earth was soft, yielding easily to her trowel, and she noted the faint traces of footprints larger than her own, deliberate in their tread leading toward Lillian Marsh's grave. She paused, her heart quickening, and examined the ground more closely. The footprints were fresh, no more than a day old, and they clustered near the grave, as if someone had stood there for some time. She thought of Victor Crane, pacing in, the dark as Elsie had described, and the shadow she had seen last night. Was it him or another? She straightened, brushing soil from her gloves, and moved toward the grave itself. The stone was unchanged, its inscription stark. Lillian Marsh, 1895 to 1905, taken too soon. But the earth at its base was disturbed, not deeply, but enough to suggest tampering a patch where the grass was flattened, as if pressed by a careful hand. Miss Marple's mind turned to the handkerchief with an L, dropped by the woman in the red coat near the mill, and Victor's interest in burial records. The pieces were scattered, but they hinted at a connection, one tied to this grave and the name it bore. She was about to kneel again when a rustle broke the silence, sharp and distinct, from behind the yew tree. She froze, her trowel still in hand, and peered into the gathering dusk. A shadow moved, swift and deliberate, and then a figure emerged. Vic Crane, his face pale in the fading light, holding a small trowel of his own. He stopped short at the sight of her, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before his smile returned, smooth as ever. "Miss Marple, tending the graves, are we?" he said, his voice light but carrying a faint strain, like a violin string stretched tight. She smiled back, her expression one of gentle surprise, though her heart was racing. "Merely the flower beds, Mr. Crane," she said, gesturing to her basket. "The vicarage roses need constant care, but you've caught me by surprise. Ah, you a gardener yourself?" Her eyes flicked to the trowel in his hand, its blade flecked with fresh soil. He laughed, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not exactly. I was checking the soil, you might say. The churchyard's history fascinates me. So many stories buried here." He glanced at Lillian Marsh's grave, then back at her, his smile unwavering but his grip on the trowel tightening. "How curious," Miss Marple said, her tone as mild as milk. "I've always found old graves rather poignant. This one, for instance, Lillian Marsh. Such a young life, cut short. Do you know her story?" His face flickered, a shadow passing over it, but he recovered quickly. "Can't say I do," he said, slipping the trowel into his coat pocket. "Just one of many, I suppose. Well, I mustn't keep you from your roses." He tipped his hat and strode toward the gate, his steps brisk but not hurried, as if he were careful not to betray haste. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing every detail: the trowel, the soil, the glance at the grave. She knelt again, pretending to adjust a bulb, and examined the disturbed earth more closely. It was subtle, but there was a small patch, no larger than a book, where the soil had been turned and pressed back, as if to conceal something. She did not dig, for that would draw attention, but she marked the spot in her memory. Whatever Victor Crane had been doing here, it was no idle curiosity. As she finished planting her bulbs, the church clock struck 7, its chimes echoing through the still air. She gathered her things and walked back to the village, her thoughts spinning like a spindle. Victor Crane's presence in the churchyard, so soon after the woman in the red coat's disappearance, was no coincidence. The trowel suggested intent, perhaps to bury or uncover something, and his unease at her presence confirmed her suspicions. He was hiding something, and the grave of Lillian Marsh was at the heart of it, back at her cottage. Miss Marple lit her lamp and settled into her chair, her knitting untouched for once. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Victor Crane, churchyard, trowel, disturbed earth near Lillian Marsh's grave. Stories buried here." She paused, then added, "Shadow last night, same as tonight." The question hung in her mind, unanswered but insistent. She thought of her old friend, Miss Hartnell, who had once remarked that men like Victor Crane were like actors, always playing to an audience. But actors, Miss Marple knew, needed a script, and Victor's was unraveling. The woman in the red coat, the name Lillian, the disturbed earth, they were all part of his performance. But the stage was growing crowded with shadows. She rose and walked to her window, gazing out at the darkened village. Hawthorn Cottage's lights burned faintly, a beacon in the night. Miss Marple thought of the angry voices she had heard there, the woman's sharp words, "You can't keep running." Had that woman been the one in the red coat? And if so, where was she now? The absence of gossip about her was as telling as its presence had been, for in St. Mary Mead's silence was often the loudest clue of all. Miss Marple decided to speak to Clara again. The typist who had seen so much and said so little. Clara's nervousness suggested she knew more than she had shared, perhaps something overheard at the solicitor's office, or gleaned from her friendship with Elsie. And then there was the handkerchief with an L, dropped by the miller, small detail. But in Miss Marple's experience, small details were the threads that held the truth together as she prepared for bed. The village clock chimed 9, its sound carrying through the still night. Miss Marple extinguished her lamp and stood by the window a moment longer, her eyes on Hawthorn Cottage. The lights flickered as if someone were moving inside, and she wondered if Victor Crane was alone. The churchyard, the grave, the woman. In the red coat, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. In St. Mary Mead, where every whisper carried weight, Miss Marple knew that shadows, like secrets, could not hide forever. Chapter 6. The letter the morning broke over St. Mary Mead with a clarity that belied the unease settling into its lanes. The mist had lifted, revealing a sky of unblemished blue, but Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a boiled egg, felt the weight of unanswered questions. The disappearance of the woman in the red coat, Victor Crane's nocturnal visit to the churchyard, and the disturbed earth near Lillian Marsh's grave had woven a tapestry of suspicion in her mind. Each thread Elsie's nervous mention of the name Lillian, Clara's reticence. The trowel in Victor's hand pointed to a pattern, but its shape remained elusive. As she buttered her toast, Miss Marple resolved to seek out new clues. For in a village where gossip was currency, silence was often a sign of something buried. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's apprentice, his cap askew and his cheeks flushed from running. "Miss Marple, sorry to bother you," he said, catching his breath. "Mrs. Clement sent me. There's something at the vicarage you ought to see. A letter, she says, and it's got the village in a tizzy." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose, but her voice remained calm. "A letter, you say? How intriguing. I'll come at once, Tommy. Thank you." She fetched her coat and hat, her mind already turning over possibilities. A letter, arriving so soon after the woman's disappearance, was unlikely to be coincidence. In St. Mary Mead, where news travelled faster than the post, a mysterious letter was as significant as a shout in the night. The vicarage was a hive of subdued excitement when she arrived. Mrs. Clement, her hands fluttering like startled birds, ushered Miss Marple into the parlour, where the vicar stood by the fireplace, holding a single sheet of paper. His face, usually genial, was creased with concern. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad you're here," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "This arrived with the morning post, addressed to no one, just to whom it may concern, and it's rather alarming." He handed her the letter, typed on plain paper, its edges crisp and unadorned. Miss Marple adjusted her glasses and read, "The truth lies buried in St. Mary Mead. Ask Victor Crane about Lillian." The words were stark, unembellished, yet they carried a weight that made her pulse quicken. No signature, no postmark, only the typed message, bold and accusing. Mrs. Clement hovered, her eyes wide. "What do you make of it, Miss Marple? It's so cryptic, like something from a novel, and mentioning Mr. Crane by name. Do you think it's about that woman in the red coat?" Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her expression one of thoughtful concern. "It's certainly curious," she said. "Typed, which suggests a certain deliberation, and the mention of Lillian. Well, that's a name we've heard before, haven't we? She thought of Elsie's hesitant confession, the grave in the churchyard, and Victor's trowel. The letter was a new thread, bold and insistent, pulling the pattern tighter. The vicar cleared his throat. I thought of showing it to Mr. Crane, but it feels indiscreet. He's been so generous to the church, and yet this letter suggests something untoward. What should we do? Miss Marple hesitated, her mind weighing the options. For now, perhaps we should keep it between us, she said. It may be a prank, or it may be something more. I'll make a few discreet inquiries, if you don't mind. She slipped the letter into her handbag, promising to return it, and left the vicarage with her thoughts in a whirl. A typed letter, anonymous and pointed, was no idle gesture. Someone in St. Mary Mead knew something or wanted others to think they did. Her first thought was of Clara, the typist at the solicitor's office, who had access to a typewriter and a keen ear for village talk. Miss Marple made her way to the high street, where the solicitor's office stood, its brass plaque gleaming in the morning sun. Clara was at her desk, typing with a focus that seemed forced, her shoulders tense. When Miss Marple entered, the girl looked up, startled, and a flush crept up her neck. "Good morning, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I was passing by and thought I'd ask if you've heard any more about our mysterious visitor in the red coat." Clara's fingers faltered on the keys. "Oh, Miss Marple, no, nothing new. She's just gone, isn't she? No one's seen her." Her eyes darted to the typewriter, then back to Miss Marple, and the older woman noted the flicker of unease. "Quite so," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair uninvited. "But there's something else, a letter, delivered to the vicarage this morning. Typed, curiously enough, and mentioning Mr. Crane and a certain Lillian. You wouldn't know anything about it, would you?" Clara's blush deepened, and her hands twisted in her lap. "A letter, No, I don't know anything about it." "Why would I?" Her voice was too quick, too defensive, and Miss Marple's instincts sharpened. "Of course, my dear," she said, her tone soothing. "It's just that you're so clever with that typewriter, and I thought you might have heard something at the post office, perhaps. You and Elsie are such good friends, and young people do notice things." Clara's eyes filled with sudden tears, and she looked away. "I didn't mean any harm," she whispered. "I typed it, Miss Marple. I sent the letter. I overheard Mr. Crane at the post office, on the telephone, talking about debts and someone named Lillian. He sounded frightened, angry. I didn't know what to do, so I wrote the letter and posted it to the vicarage. I thought it might make someone look into it without me getting involved." Miss Marple reached out, patting Clara's hand. "You did what you thought was right, my dear. But tell me everything you heard. It may be important." Clara took a shaky breath. "It was last week, at the post office. Mr. Crane was in the telephone box, and the door was ajar. He didn't see me, but I heard him say, 'Lillian, you can't keep doing this. The debts are paid, but not like this.' And then he said something about the churchyard, about it being safe now. I didn't understand, but it scared me. I typed the letter that night and posted it the next day." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Debts, Lillian, the churchyard. The words echoed Elsie's account, the disturbed earth, the trowel in Victor's hand. "You've been very brave, Clara," she said. "But for now, let's keep this between us. No need to worry Elsie or anyone else. I'll see what can be done." She left the solicitor's office, her thoughts a tangle of new threads. Clara's confession confirmed that Victor Crane was entangled in something deeper than village gossip. The letter was a cry for attention, a nudge to uncover what he was hiding. But why mention Lillian? Was she the woman in the red coat, or a ghost from his past, tied to the grave in the churchyard? Miss Marple decided to visit the post office, where Mrs. Price was sure to have more to share. The postmistress greeted her with a knowing smile, her spectacles glinting. "Miss Marple, you're out and about again. Heard about that letter at the vicarage, have you? The whole village is buzzing. Who'd write such a thing, and why point the finger at Mr. Crane?" "It's certainly a puzzle," Miss Marple said, selecting a postcard. "Perhaps someone with a typewriter and a grudge. Have you noticed anything unusual about Mr. Crane lately?" Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Well, now you mention it, he was here yesterday, asking about express trains to London. Looked nervous, kept glancing at the door, and he posted a parcel small, wrapped in brown paper. Didn't say what it was, but he was particular about it being sent quickly. A parcel." Miss Marple's mind flashed to Elsie's account of Victor in the churchyard, clutching a brown paper package. "How interesting," she said. "Did you happen to see the address?" Mrs. Price shook her head. "He covered it with his hand, but I caught a glimpse London, I think. He paid extra for it to go by the next train." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped into the street, her thoughts spinning. A parcel, a letter, a million. The pieces were accumulating, each one a clue to Victor Crane's purpose in Mary Mead. She thought of the disturbed earth by the grave, the shadow in the churchyard, the angry words overheard at Hawthorn Cottage. The woman in the red coat, whether Lillian or not, had vanished, but her presence lingered like a scent in the air. That evening, as the village settled into its quiet rhythm, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched. She opened her notebook and wrote, anonymous letter, typed, Clara's confession. Victor Crane, telephone, debts, Lillian, churchyard, safe now. Parcel to London. She paused, then added, woman in red coat, still missing. The entries were stark, but they formed a pattern, one that pointed to a truth, buried not just in the churchyard, but in Victor's past. She thought of a story from her youth, of a man who had sent anonymous letters to a village, stirring fear until his own secrets were exposed. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that letters, like gossip, were tools sometimes of truth, sometimes of deception. Clara's letter was a spark, and Miss Marple intended to follow its light. She would watch Victor Crane, and she would listen for an Mary Mead, where every word carried weight. The truth was never far from the surface. Chapter 7. Clara's confession. The late morning sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the ancient elms that lined the high street. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her drawing room with a cup of chamomile tea, felt the quiet pulse of the village, its rhythm disrupted by the anonymous letter that had arrived at the vicarage. The typed words, the truth, lies buried in St. Mary Mead. Ask Victor Crane about Lillian had set her mind alight. Their stark accusation, pointing to a secret that refused to stay buried. Clara's whispered admission at the solicitor's office, that she had typed and sent the letter after overhearing Victor Crane's telephone conversation, was a new thread in the tapestry, one that Miss Marple intended to follow with care. She set her teacup down and considered Clara's words. Victor speaking of debts, Lillian and the churchyard being safe now. The girl's fear had been palpable, her confession a mixture of guilt and relief, as if she had unburdened herself of a weight too heavy to carry alone. Miss Marple knew that young people, like Clara, often acted on impulse, their actions revealing more than they intended. The letter was no prank, it was a plea for someone to look closer, and Miss Marple was determined to do so. She decided to visit Clara again, this time at her home, where the girl might speak more freely away from the solicitor's office. Clara lived with her aunt, Mrs. Hayworth, in a small cottage behind the bakery, its windows framed with geraniums and its doorstep swept clean. Miss Marple walked the short distance, her basket swinging lightly, containing a jar of her homemade quince jelly as a pretext for the visit. The village was alive with its usual children playing near the green. Mr. Tuttle stacking apples outside his shop, but there was a subtle tension, as if the letter's existence had rippled through the community. Unspoken, but felt, Mrs. Hayworth answered the door, her flower-dusted apron a testament to her morning's work. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure," she exclaimed, wiping her hands. Come in, come in." Clara's in the parlour, mending a skirt. She's been quiet lately. Not herself. Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of kindly concern. "I thought I'd bring some jelly for your scones," she said, handing over the jar. "And perhaps a word with Clara, if she's not too busy." Mrs. Hayworth ushered her inside, calling for Clara, who appeared with a needle and thread in hand, her face pale and her eyes wary. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but strained, "I didn't expect you." "I was passing by, my dear," Miss Marple said, settling into a chintz-covered chair, "and I thought we might have a little chat. Your aunt's scones deserve my best jelly, don't they?" She smiled, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing of Clara's nervous fidgeting. Mrs. Hayworth excused herself to check the oven, leaving them alone. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone gentle but direct. "Clara, you were very brave to tell me about the letter yesterday. It's helped me see things more clearly, but I wonder if there's anything else you might have remembered about Mr. Crane's conversation, perhaps, or anything you've seen since." Clara's fingers twisted the thread, snapping it. She glanced at the door, then lowered her voice. "I didn't tell you everything, Miss Marple. I was scared. After I heard him on the telephone, I saw him again the next day at the post office. He was sending that parcel, like Mrs. Price said, but he was different, jumpy, like he was afraid of being watched. And when he left, I saw him drop something, a piece of paper, folded small. I picked it up, but I didn't look at it. I was too frightened." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her voice remained calm. "A piece of paper. Do you still have it, Clara?" Clara nodded, her hands trembling as she reached into her apron pocket. She produced a small, crumpled slip, its edges worn. "I kept it, but I haven't opened it." It felt wrong, like I was meddling in something dangerous. Miss Marple took the paper, her fingers steady despite the thrill of discovery. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a handwritten note in a hurried scrawl. "Meet me at the mill, midnight." L. The ink was smudged, but the initial was clear, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to the handkerchief with an L, dropped by the woman in the red coat. "This is very helpful, Clara," she said, slipping the note into her handbag. "You've done the right thing. But tell me, have you seen Mr. Crane with anyone else since then?" Clara shook her head. "Not with anyone, but he's been to the churchyard again. I saw him yesterday evening, from my window. He was near that grave, you know, Lillian Marsh's. He didn't stay long, just stood there, looking down. It gave me the shivers." Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile reassuring. You've been very observant, my dear. Let's keep this between us for now. No need to worry your aunt or Elsie. I'll see what can be made of this note." She rose, her mind already turning over the new clue. A meeting at the mill, an initial, another visit to the churchyard. The pattern was tightening, each thread pulling her closer to the truth. She left the cottage and walked toward the vicarage, intending to borrow the parish register to check Lillian Marsh's details. The vicar, ever obliging, welcomed her into his study, where the register lay open on a cluttered desk. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure," he said, pushing aside a pile of sermons. "Still curious about our local history?" "Just a small matter," she said, her tone light. "I'd like to look at the burial records, if I may. Around 1905, I think." The vicar nodded, turning the heavy pages to the year in question. Miss Marple scanned the entries, her finger pausing at Lillian. "Marsh died 1905, aged 30, cause pneumonia. Buried St. Mary Mead churchyard." The record was brief, noting her as a local girl, married to a man named Edward Marsh, who had left the village soon after her death. No mention of Victor Crane, yet the name Lillian linked the grave to the note, the letter, and Elsie's overheard argument. Miss Marple thanked the vicar and left, her thoughts a whirl of connections. As she walked home, she passed Hawthorn Cottage, its windows dark despite the midday hour. She paused, noting the stillness, and wondered if Victor Crane was inside, or if he had slipped away to the churchyard or the mill. The note in her handbag felt heavy, its single line, "Meet me at the mill." Midnight, a whisper from the missing woman in the red coat. Was she Lillian, or someone else using the name to unsettle Victor? And why the mill, a place of shadows and secrets? That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the mill, her pretext a sketchbook to capture the picturesque ruin for her niece. The structure loomed by the sluggish stream, its stones green with moss and its door still ajar, as she had found it before. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, and searched for signs of a midnight meeting. The floor was damp, scattered with leaves, but near the far wall, she found a fresh cigarette stub, its tip crushed as if in haste. She pocketed it, careful not to disturb the scene, and noted a faint scrape in the dust, as if something small had been dragged. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched as she opened her notebook. She wrote, "Clara's note. Meet at mill, midnight, L. Victor at churchyard again. Lillian Marsh, 1905, pneumonia, husband Edward. Cigarette stub at mill." She paused, then added, "Woman in red coat, still missing." The entries were growing, each one a stitch in the pattern she was weaving. She thought of a case from years ago, when a young woman in a neighboring village had sent a note to expose a secret, only to vanish herself. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that notes, like letters, were often cries for help or warnings. Clara's confession had opened a door, and Miss Marple intended to step through it. She would watch Victor Crane, and she would listen, for in St. Mary Mead, where every shadow held a story, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 8. The Nighttime Visitor. The night draped St. Mary Mead in a velvet hush, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. Miss Jane Marple, unable to sleep, sat by her drawing-room window, her knitting idle in her lap. The village lay quiet, its cottages dark, but her mind was alight with the threads of the mystery that had woven itself around Victor Crane. Clara's confession, the anonymous letter, the note signed with an L. and the cigarette stub at the malal pointed to a secret tied to the churchyard and the name Lillian. The woman in the red coat, whose absence now echoed louder than her presence, was a missing piece, and Miss Marple sensed that the truth was close, lurking in the shadows of the night. She adjusted her shawl, her eyes fixed on Hawthorn Cottage, its windows glowing faintly against the darkness. The note Clara had found meet me at the mill. Midnight. Elle suggested a rendezvous that had either happened or been abandoned, and the cigarette stub hinted at someone's presence at the mill. Miss Marple's instincts told her that Victor Crane was not alone in his secrets, and the angry voices she had overheard at his cottage days ago lingered in her memory. You can't keep running. Tonight, she decided, she would watch, for the night often revealed what the day concealed. She donned her dark coat, its muted color blending with the shadows, and slipped a small torch into her pocket. Her plan was simple: to observe Hawthorn Cottage from the safety of the hedge across the lane, where she could see without being seen. The village clock struck 11 as she stepped outside, its chimes soft but clear, and she moved with the quiet grace of one accustomed to going unnoticed. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading roses, and the stars above were sharp points of light in the cloudless sky. Miss Marple settled behind the hedge, her back against a sturdy oak, and trained her eyes on the cottage. The lights flickered, as if someone were moving from room to room, and she noted the curtains, drawn but not fully closed, allowing slivers of light to escape. She waited, her patience honed by years of observation, her senses attuned to the smallest sound. At 11:30, a figure approached the Khatija woman, not in a red coat, but a dark shawl, her movements swift and furtive. Miss Marple's heart quickened as the woman knocked softly, the sound barely audible, and slipped inside when the door opened. The encounter was brief. 10 minutes later, the door opened again, and the woman emerged, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Miss Marple strained to see her face, but the darkness and the shawl obscured it. She caught a glimpse of blonde hair, pale as moonlight, before the woman hurried down the lane toward the village green. Miss Marple considered following, but hesitated. Pursuit would risk discovery, and she preferred to gather her clues in silence. Instead, she noted the woman's gait quick, almost panicked in the direction she took, away from the mill and the churchyard. She waited until the lights in Hawthorn Cottage dimmed, then crept closer, her torch unused to preserve her night vision. The cottage was still now, its windows dark, but she lingered, her eyes scanning the garden. Near the gate, she spotted a small object glinting in the grasser button, pearl-like and delicate, likely from a woman's coat. She pocketed it, careful not to disturb the surrounding earth, and returned to her hiding spot, her mind racing. The button, the blonde hair, the dark shoulder tails that might mean nothing or everything, depending on what came next as she made her way home. The village clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the silent streets. Miss Marple thoughts turned to the woman in the red coat. Was she the nighttime visitor, trading her conspicuous scarlet for a discreet shawl? Or was this another player in Victor Crane's drama, drawn to St. Mary Mead by the same secrets that had brought him here? The note signed L suggested a connection to Lillian, whether the long-dead Marsh or the missing woman, and the button was a new clue. Small but significant. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a single lamp and settled into her chair, her knitting untouched. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Nighttime visitor, woman, blonde hair, dark shawl, brief visit to Hawthorn Cottage, 11:30, pearl button in garden. Victor Crane, lights dimmed after. She paused, then added, connection to woman in red coat. The question hung in the air, unanswered but pressing. She thought of the cigarette stub at the mill, the disturbed earth by Lillian Marsh's grave, and Clara's overheard conversation about debts and the churchyard being safe now. The nighttime visitor added a new layer, suggesting that Victor was not alone in his schemes. Miss Marple recalled a story from her youth of a woman who visited a village at night, leaving only whispers and a single clue glove dropped in haste. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that nighttime visitors often carried secrets, and secrets, in St. Mary Mead, had a way of coming to light. She decided to telephone her nephew, Inspector Dermot Craddock, in the morning. Dermot, with his access to London records, could check for any connection between Victor Crane and a woman named Lillian, living or dead. For now, she would keep her vigil, her eyes on the village and its shadows. She rose and checked the lock on her door, a precaution she rarely took, and returned to her window. Hawthorn Cottage was dark now, but she imagined Victor inside, restless and watchful, his secrets pressing against the walls as she prepared for bed. Miss Marple's mind returned to the button, its pearl-like sheen a small beacon in her thoughts. It was the kind of detail that could unravel a mystery, like a loose thread in her knitting. She thought of the woman in the dark shawl, her blonde hair a fleeting glimpse in the night. Was she Lillian, or someone else drawn into Victor's orbit? The anonymous letter, the note at the mill, the grave in the churchyard, all were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. The clock chimed 1, its sound a soft reminder of time's steady march. Miss Marple extinguished her lamp and stood by the window a moment longer, her eyes on the silent village. In St. Mary Mead, where every shadow held a story, she knew that the truth was never far from reach, waiting only for the right moment to step into the light. Chapter 9. The London Connection. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a soft, rosy glow, painting the village in hues of promise. Yet Miss Jane Marple felt a chill that had little to do with the crisp October air, seated at her breakfast table. With a pot of tea and a single slice of toast, she turned over the events of the previous night. The woman in the dark shawl, her blonde hair catching the moonlight, the pearl button dropped in Victor Crane's garden, and the persistent echo of the name Lillian, the anonymous letter, Clara's confession, and the note signed L had tightened the web of suspicion around Victor. But the nighttime visitor had added a new thread, one that suggested his secrets reached beyond the village's borders. Miss Marple knew that to unravel this mystery, she needed to look further afield, and her nephew, Inspector Dermot Craddock, was her key to the wider world. She sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the notebook on the table, its pages filled with her meticulous entries. The button, small and pearlescent, lay beside it, a tangible clue that felt heavier than its size suggested. She thought of the woman in the red coat, now vanished, and the name Lillian, which linked the churchyard grave to the note found by Clara. Victor Crane's actions, his pacing in the churchyard, his guarded charm, his hurried parcel to London pointed to a past he was desperate to keep buried. Miss Marple resolved to telephone Dermot, whose position at Scotland Yard gave him access to records that might shed light on Victor's history. She walked to the post office, where the village's only public telephone stood in a cramped booth, its glass smudged with fingerprints. Mrs. Price, ever vigilant behind her counter, greeted her with a knowing nod. "Miss Marple, you're up early. Still poking about that letter, I'll wager." The vicarage is all aflutter, and Mr. Crane was here yesterday, looking like a man with the devil on his tail." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as mild as ever. "Just a call to my nephew, Mrs. Price. Family matters, you know. Has Mr. Crane been sending more parcels?" Mrs. Price leaned forward, her spectacles glinting. "Not since that one to London, but he asked about the next train out wanted. To know if it stopped at Bristol. Said he might be leaving soon, though he was vague about it. Looked pale, if you ask me, like he hadn't slept." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped into the booth, dialing Dermot's number with care. The line crackled, but his familiar voice soon came through, warm but tinged with the impatience of a busy man. "Aunt Jane, what's this? Another mystery in St. Mary Mead?" She chuckled softly. "I'm afraid so, Dermot. I need your help with a name Victor Crane, recently arrived here, and a woman named Lillian, possibly connected to him. There's a grave here, Lillian Marsh, died 1905, but I suspect there's more to it. Could you check London records for any link between them? Marriages, debts, anything at all?" Dermot's tone sharpened with interest. "Victor Crane and Lillian, you say? I'll see what I can find. Anything else I should know?" Miss Marple hesitated, then mentioned the anonymous letter, the woman in the red coat, and the note signed L. She kept her voice light, as if discussing a minor village matter, but Dermot knew better. "Sounds like you've got a tangle, Aunt Jane. I'll call back tonight with whatever I find. Stay out of trouble, will you?" She smiled, promising nothing, and hung up. As she left the post office, she noted Victor Crane crossing the High Street, his leather case in hand, his stride purposeful but his eyes scanning the street as if expecting pursuit. She ducked behind a display of apples outside Mr. Tuttle's shop, watching as he entered Hawthorn Cottage, the door closing swiftly behind him. Her next stop was the vicarage, where she hoped to glean more from Mrs. Clement, whose knack for picking up village whispers was almost as sharp as her own. The vicar's wife was in the garden, tying back a wayward clematis, and greeted Miss Marple with a flurry of excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, that letter has us all in a state. The vicar's talking of showing it to the police, but I said we should wait, and have you heard? Mr. Crane was at the church again, looking at the old gravestones. Said he's writing a history, but who believes that?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "A history? How interesting. Did he mention any names? Lillian Marsh, perhaps?" Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. "Not that I heard, but he was awfully particular about the older graves, the ones near the yew tree, and he asked about visitors. To the churchyard, wanted to know if anyone comes at night." The vicar thought it odd, but you know how he is, always seeing the best in people. Miss Marple thanked her and left, her thoughts turning to the nighttime visitor. The woman in the dark shawl, with her blonde hair and hurried exit, was a puzzle. Was she the same as the woman in the red coat, or another figure drawn into Victor's orbit? The button in her pocket suggested a connection, but it was too early to be certain. That evening, as the village settled into its quiet rhythm, Dermot telephoned. His voice was brisk, tinged with the satisfaction of a good find. "Aunt Jane, you've got a nose for trouble. Victor Crane was married to a Lillian Marsh in London, 1903. She died in 1905, officially of pneumonia. But there were whispers of foul, plain nothing proven, mind you. Crane inherited her money, a tidy sum, and left London soon after. No record of him since, until he turned up in your village. As for other Lillians, nothing yet, but I'll keep looking." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Thank you, Dermot. That's most helpful. Could you check if Lillian had any family, a sister, perhaps, or a friend who might have come looking for answers? Will do, he said. But be careful, Aunt Jane. If Crane's mixed up in something, he won't like you sniffing around. She assured him she would be discreet and hung up, her mind racing. Victor Crane, married to Lillian Marsh, who died under a cloud of suspicion. The grave in the churchyard, the disturbed earth, the note signed L. It all pointed to a past he was desperate to keep buried. The woman in the red coat, with her blonde hair and her argument at the mill, could be a sister, a friend, or someone else entirely. Seeking to unearth the truth, Miss Marple opened her notebook and wrote, Victor Crane married Lillian Marsh, 1903. She died 1905. Pneumonia, whispers of foul play. Inherited money, left London. Nighttime visitor, blonde. Hair, pearl button. She paused, then added, Woman in red coat sister. Friend, seeking justice. The entries were growing, each one a stitch in the pattern she was weaving. She thought of a case from her youth, of a man whose past had followed him to a quiet village, brought by a woman who refused to let his secrets rest. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that the past had a way of catching up, especially in a place like St. Mary Mead, where every stranger was noticed. She would watch Victor Crane, and she would wait for the nighttime visitor to return for the truth. Like the stars above, was clearest in the dark. Chapter 10. Tea and Truth. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of its cobblestone lanes and bathing the village in a deceptive calm. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her drawing room with a tray of tea and scones, felt the weight of the mystery pressing closer. The revelations from her nephew, Inspector Dermot Craddock, had sharpened the pattern in her mind. Victor Crane, married to Lillian Marsh, who died under suspicion in 1905, inheriting her fortune before vanishing from London. The anonymous letter. The note signed L, the nighttime visitor with blonde hair, and the pearl button found in Victor's gardenal pointed to a truth buried deep, yet rising to the surface like a bubble in still water. The woman in the red coat, absent but ever present in the village's whispers, was the key, and Miss Marple intended to turn it. She had decided to invite Victor Crane for tea, a seemingly innocent gesture that would allow her to observe him closely. In St. Mary Mead, where a teacup could hold as many secrets as a confessional, such invitations were a delicate art. She sent a note to Hawthorn Cottage, penned in her neat hand, expressing concern for his safety after the anonymous letter and suggesting a friendly chat. The bait was subtle, but Miss Marple knew men like Victor charming, cautious, and unlikely to resist the chance to gauge what an old spinster might know. He arrived promptly at 4, his grey suit impeccable, his smile as polished as ever. Miss Marple, how kind of you to invite me, he said, settling into her chin-scovered armchair. This is a charming cottage, quite the heart of the village, I imagine. She poured tea, her movements deliberate, her eyes noting the faint tension in his jaw. I like to think so, she said, offering him a scone. St. Mary Mead has its charms, but it's a place where little goes unnoticed. That letter to the vicarage, for instance, such a stir it's caused. Victor's hand paused on his cup, his smile unwavering but his eyes narrowing slightly. A prank, surely, he said, his voice smooth. Village gossip can be cruel, can't it? Pointing fingers at newcomers like me. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle concern. Oh, I'm sure it's nothing serious. But the name, Lillian, it's curious, don't you think? There's a grave in the churchyard, Lillian Marsh, long gone. I wondered if you might know of her, being so interested in our local history. His fingers tightened on the cup, a movement so slight it might have gone unnoticed, but Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. Lillian Marsh, he said, his tone light but strained. I'm afraid not. A distant cousin, perhaps, from years ago, but nothing more. Names do repeat, don't they? Indeed they do, Miss Marple said, spreading jam on her scone. Though it's odd how they resurface. That woman in the red coat, for instance, she was seen with you at the mill, I hear. And then she vanished, just as the letter appeared. People do talk. Victor's smile faltered, and for a moment his eyes darted to the window as if seeking escape. Village tales, he said, recovering quickly. I met a woman briefly, a business acquaintance from London. She came to discuss a matter of investments, nothing more. As for her leaving, I assume she caught her train. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. Of course, though I did hear you were seen in the churchyard near Lillian Marsh's grave, and with a trowel, no less. Were you planting something, perhaps? His laugh was short, almost sharp. Planting? No, just curious. Old graves have a certain allure, don't they? I was merely looking. He set his cup down, a faint clink, betraying his unease. You're a clever woman, Miss Marple. You see a great deal. Only what's there to see, she said, her voice soft but pointed. The churchyard, the letter, the woman in the red coat, it all weaves together, doesn't it? And that note, the one about a meeting at the mill, signed with an L, it makes one wonder. Victor's face paled, and he stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. I'm afraid I must go, he said, his charm fraying at the edges. Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple. You've given me much to think about. As he reached for his hat, a scrap of paper slipped from his pocket, fluttering to the floor. He didn't notice, but Miss Marple did, her eyes following it as he hurried out. She retrieved the paper as soon as the door closed, her heart quickening. It was a receipt from a London jeweller, dated 2 days ago, for a locket inscribed with LM. The sum was modest, but the inscription was a beacon in her thoughts. She slipped it into her handbag, her mind racing. A locket, a grave, a woman in a red coat, all tied to the name Lillian. The woman was no ghost. Miss Marple was certain now. She was alive, or had been, and Victor's agitation suggested he was desperate to keep her hidden. She opened her notebook and wrote T with Victor Crane. Evasive about Lillian Marsh, claims distant cousin. Denies the significance of woman in red coat. Trowel in churchyard, curious. Receipt for locket, LM, London jeweller. She paused, then added, woman in red coat, alive, connected to LM. The pattern was clearer now, its threads tightening. Around Victor's carefully constructed facade, Miss Marple thought of a case from years ago, of a man who had bought a gift to appease a woman from his past, only to find it became his undoing. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that tokens, like lockets, often carried more than sentiment. They carried intent. Victor's purchase suggested a gesture, perhaps to placate or deceive, but to whom? The woman in the dark shawl, with her blonde hair, or the vanished woman in the red coat? She rose and walked to her window, gazing out at Hawthorn Cottage, its lights dim but steady. Victor was there, she knew, pacing or planning, his secrets pressing against the walls. The locket, the note, The gravel pointed to a truth he could not outrun. Miss Marple recalled the angry words overheard at his cottage, the woman's sharp rebuke, "You can't keep running." The receipt in her handbag was proof that he was trying and failing. She decided to telephone Dermot again, to ask if the London records mentioned a locket or any recent activity tied to Victor Crane. For now, she would keep the receipt close, its small weight a reminder of the truth she was closing in on. In St. Mary Mead, where every gesture was noticed, Miss Marple knew that the smallest clue, a button, a note, a locket, could unravel a man's carefully woven lies. She would watch, and she would wait, for the truth was never far from the surface, ready to break free in the light of her quiet scrutiny. Chapter 11. The grave revealed the night air in St. Mary Mead was sharp with the scent of frost, the stars above gleaming like scattered pins in a velvet sky. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her warmest shawl, sat by her window, her knitting untouched, as her mind wove through the threads of the mystery that had ensnared the village. The receipt for a locket inscribed with LM, dropped by Victor Crane during their tea, had sharpened her focus. It linked him to Lillian Marsh, whose grave in the churchyard had been disturbed, and to the woman in the red coat, whose absence now loomed larger than her presence. The anonymous letter, Clara's confession, the note signed L, the nighttime visitor with blonde hair, and Dermot's revelation of Victor's marriage to Lillian Marsh in 1903 all converged on a truth that Miss Marple felt was within reach, buried but stirring. Her tea with Victor had confirmed his unease, his evasive answers and hurried departure, betraying a man cornered by his past. The locket, purchased in London just days ago, suggested a gesture perhaps, to appease or deceive, but to whom? The woman in the dark shawl, or the vanished woman in the red coat? Miss Marple's instincts told her that the churchyard held the key, its disturbed earth a silent witness to Victor's secrets. She resolved to act, for the pattern was clear now, and delay might let the truth slip back into the shadows. She telephoned her nephew, Inspector Dermot Craddock, that morning, her voice calm but urgent. "Dermot, I need you in St. Mary Mead," she said, recounting the receipt, the locket, and Victor's behavior. "There's something hidden in the churchyard, near Lillian Marsh's grave. I believe Victor Crane is planning to leave, and we must move quickly." Dermot, accustomed to his aunt's uncanny instincts, promised to arrive by evening with a small team. "You're stirring up trouble again, Aunt Jane," he said, a note of amusement in his voice. "I'll be there by dusk. Don't go digging graves on your own." Miss Marple smiled, assuring him she would wait, but her mind was already at the churchyard, envisioning the disturbed earth she had seen days ago. She spent the day in quiet preparation, visiting the vicarage to borrow a lantern under the pretext of an evening walk. Mrs. Clement, ever eager to share news, mentioned that Victor had been seen at the station, inquiring about the next train to London, his leather case in hand. "He looked dreadful," she said, her eyes wide, "like a man who hasn't slept in days." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild concern. "Perhaps he's unwell," she said, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Victor's inquiries about trains suggested flight, and the locket receipt hinted at a final act before departure. She thanked Mrs. Clement and returned home, her resolve firm. The churchyard would yield its secrets tonight, with Dermot's help. As dusk fell, the village settled into its evening hush, the lights of Hawthorn Cottage burning faintly. Miss Marple met Dermot at the churchyard gate, his tall figure accompanied by two constables, their faces serious but curious. "Aunt Jane, you've got us chasing shadows," he said, his tone half teasing. "What's this about a grave?" She led them to Lillian Marsh's stone, its inscription barely visible in the fading light. Lillian Marsh, 1895 to 1905. Taken too soon. She pointed to the patch of earth at its base, where the grass was flattened, subtly turned. "Here," she said. "I saw Victor Crane with the trowel, and the soil's been disturbed. There's something hidden, I'm sure of it." Dermot nodded, signaling to a constable who carried a small spade. "Careful, now," he said. "We don't want to disturb more than we must." The constable dug gently, the earth yielding easily, and within moments, he uncovered a small metal box, its surface tarnished but intact. Dermot lifted it, brushing off the soil, and opened it under the glow of Miss Marple's lantern. Inside were letters, yellowed but legible, and a photograph of a young woman with blonde hair, her face strikingly similar to the description of the woman in the red coat. The letters, dated 1904 and 1905, were addressed to Victor Crane, signed Lillian. They spoke of love, betrayal, and a plan to start anew, with references to money and a promise to keep silent. The photograph, dated last year, bore a handwritten note on the back: "Lillian, 1924, London." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Lillian Marsh, presumed dead, was alive or had been. As recently as a year ago, Dermot's face was grim as he read the letters. "This changes everything," he said. "If Lillian Marsh didn't die in 1905, Crane's got a lot to answer for. These letters suggest he faked her death, likely for her money, and kept her hidden." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "The woman in the red coat," she said. "She must be Lillian, come to confront him. The argument at the mill, the note signed L, the locket inscribed LM. It all fits. But where is she now?" Dermot's eyes narrowed. "If she's alive, she's in danger. Crane's been acting like a man on the run. We need to find him before he bolts." They returned to the village, the box secured in Dermot's care. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the nighttime visitor, the woman with blonde hair in a dark shawl. Was she Lillian, or another drawn into Victor's scheme? The locket suggested a gesture of appeasement, but the disturbed earth hinted at something darker, planned to silence her permanently, perhaps. She recalled Victor's trowel, his pacing in the churchyard, and the receipt for the locket, all pointing to a man desperate to bury his past. Dermot and his men went to Hawthorn Cottage, only to find it empty, the door ajar and Victor's leather case gone. A neighbour reported seeing him head toward the station, and Dermot dispatched a constable to intercept him. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to her cottage, her notebook open before her. She wrote, "Metal box in churchyard. Letters from Lillian. 1904 to 1905. Photograph, Lillian, 1924. Faked death, inherited money. Victor planning to flee." She paused, then added, "Woman in red coat, Lillian Marsh, alive, in danger." She thought of a case from her youth, of a man who had buried evidence to hide a crime, only to have it unearthed by a persistent observer. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that secrets, like seeds, could not stay buried forever. Victor Crane had tried to outrun his past, but the grave had spoken, and Lillian Marsh, whether dead or alive, was its voice as the village clock struck 10. Miss Marple sat by her window, her eyes on the darkened station. She knew Dermot would find Victor, for men like him, driven by guilt or fear, always made mistakes. The truth, revealed by the churchyard's silent earth, was closing in, and in St. Mary Mead, where every secret left a trace, Miss Marple was ready to see it through. Chapter 12. The village settles. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a gentle warmth, as if to soothe the village after the storm of secrets that had swept through its lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room, her knitting resumed. At last, the pale pink shawl growing steadily beneath her fingers. The events of the previous night, the discovery of the metal box in the churchyard, the letters and photograph revealing Lillian Marsh's survival, and Victor Crane's desperate attempt to flee had brought the mystery to a close, though not without leaving ripples in the village's quiet surface. Her nephew, Inspector Dermot Craddock, had acted swiftly, and the truth, like a buried seed, had broken free at last. Victor Crane had been apprehended at the station, his leather case clutched tightly, his face a mask of defeat as Dermot's constables escorted him away. The box's contents letters from Lillian Marsh, written in 1904 and 1905, and a photograph dated 1924, had unraveled his carefully woven lies. Lillian, presumed dead of pneumonia in 1905, had been alive, hidden in London under a new name. Her existence a secret Victor had guarded to protect the fortune he had inherited through her faked death. The woman in the red coat, seen arguing with him at the mill, was Lillian herself, come to St. Mary Mead to confront him, to demand her freedom and her life back. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the window where the village stirred with its usual rhythm. The letters, penned in Lillian's elegant hand, had spoken of love turned to betrayal, of a plan to escape debts by staging her death, and of Victor's promise to keep her safe in exchange for her silence. But silence, Miss Marple knew, was a heavy burden, and Lillian had grown weary of it. The note signed L, the argument at the mill, the locket inscribed with LM, all were her attempts to reclaim her identity, to force Victor to face the past he had buried. The nighttime visitor, with her blonde hair and dark shawl, had been Lillian too. Miss Marple was certain now. The pearl button, dropped in Victor's garden, matched the coat she had worn in the photograph, a detail that had sealed the connection. Her visits to Hawthorn Cottage, brief and furtive, were pleas or threats, each one pushing Victor closer to desperation. The disturbed earth by the churchyard grave, where he had hidden the box, suggested a darker intent, perhaps to bury more than letters, to silence Lillian permanently with the trowel Miss Marple had seen in his hand. Dermot had shared the final pieces that morning, telephoning from the station where Victor was held. Lillian Marsh, found alive in a London boarding house, had been brought to St. Mary Mead under police protection. Her story was one of coercion and fear Victor had orchestrated. Her death to claim her inheritance, convincing her it was the only way to escape his debts. For 20 years, she had lived under an assumed name, bound by his threats, until courage or desperation drove her to confront him. The red coat, so conspicuous in the village, was her defiance, a declaration that she would no longer hide. Miss Marple had met her briefly at the vicarage, where Lillian, now grey but still striking, sat with a cup of tea, her hands steady but her eyes haunted. "I thought I could make him confess," she had said, her voice low. "I wanted my name back, my life, but he was afraid, and fear makes men dangerous." Miss Marple had nodded, her heart heavy with understanding. Lillian's return was a victory, but it carried the weight of years lost, of a life stolen by a man's greed. The village, true to its nature, had already begun to weave new stories. Mrs. Price, at the post office, spoke of Lillian's courage with a mix of awe and pity, while Mrs. Clement, at the vicarage, declared it a miracle, like a resurrection from the churchyard itself. Elsie, Barrow and Clara, relieved of their secrets, were quieter now, their roles in the mystery fading into the background. The anonymous letter, Clara's impulsive act, had been the spark that lit the truth, and Miss Marple had made a point to praise her gently, knowing the girl's guilt would linger. As she knitted, Miss Marple reflected on the power of whispers. The gossip that had begun with Victor Crane's arrival, his pacing in the churchyard. The woman in the red coat, the dropped handkerchief, had grown into a force that uncovered a grave injustice. In St. Mary Mead, where every glance was noted, gossip was not merely idle talk. It was a mirror, reflecting truths that might otherwise stay hidden. The letter, the note, the button, the locket, all were fragments of that mirror. Pieced together by her quiet observation, she opened her notebook. Its pages now a chronicle of the case. She wrote, Victor Crane arrested. Lillian Marsh alive, confronted him. Faked death, 1905. Inherited fortune. Letters, photograph in churchyard box. Woman in red coat, Lillian, seeking justice. Locket, button, note all hers. She paused, then added, village gossip, the spark. Closing the notebook, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The pattern was complete, its threads neatly tied. Miss Marple thought of a story from her youth, of a village where a single rumour had unravelled a hidden crime, saving a life just as Lillian's had been saved. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that truth, like her knitting, required patience and care. Victor Crane had underestimated St. Mary Mead, its watchful eyes and whispering tongues, and in doing so had undone himself. The village clock chimed noon, its sound carrying through the open window. Miss Marple rose, setting her knitting aside, and looked out at the high street, where life resumed its gentle pace. Hawthorn Cottage stood empty now, its windows dark, its secrets laid bare. Lillian Marsh, free at last, would leave for London soon, to reclaim what remained of her life. The village would talk of her for a while, then turn to new stories. As it always did, Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking once more. St. Mary Mead was quiet again, its surface smooth, but she knew it would not last. Gossip, like her roses, was perennial, blooming anew with each stranger who crossed its paths. She would be ready, her eyes sharp and her mind keen, for in the quiet of the village, the truth was never far from reach, waiting only for a whisper to bring it to light. The end.